we need to engage men, but does it work? Are we going to begin taking away resources from programs and interventions in empowering women that we have some evidence that they work? Is this worth investing in? What kind of evidence do we have that men, as a result of these interventions, will change? And we did a review of existing intervention data, impact evaluation data, and found 57 studies in the area of sexual and reproductive health, HIV, maternal and child health, fatherhood programs, and GBV prevention. Found 57 of them that had reasonably rigorous impact evaluation studies. These range from group education, some of these were services-based, others we categorized as community outreach, and then integrated means they had one or more of the above there. And then we categorized them based on, was there reasonably strong evidence of behavior change? And that we gave the green light for effective. And that was about a fourth of the programs. Promising were those that showed reasonable evidence of attitude change. Not necessarily changes in behaviors, but at least changes in attitudes. That was close to 40%. And then about 37% the evidence was unclear. There wasn't quite enough evidence to say we could affirm that men were changing as a result of those interventions. So there's a snippet of evidence, but I think it's important to acknowledge a few things about this evidence. Overall, the intervention that we've most found shows, maybe it's the one that we've most evaluated, not to say it's the only thing that works, is well-designed group education. In the case of the work that I was involved in the context of Brazil, we designed some materials called Program H for Hombres in Spanish and Homens in Portuguese, a set of group education activities based on kind of a Paulo Freirean approach of promoting a critical reflection about masculinities. First, men looked at how they were raised in certain versions of manhood, how they felt about that, experiences about that, then reflected on how those versions of manhood affect women and girls, and then think about ways that they could promote change in their own lives and in the world around them. If we can get men to sit through 10 to 14 of those sessions, we can often see some interesting changes. And I would guess those of you who work at the practitioner level in the room have seen and experienced similar kinds of changes when men genuinely participate in such activities with well-trained facilitators, and particularly when we can echo what happens in those sessions in the world beyond. If we can somehow also reinforce those messages so it doesn't feel like that kind of fake group and then I go back to my real life world where I don't get any points if I'm a nice guy. That if we can echo and reinforce what happens in those groups outside, we can often see some reasonably sustainable behavior change in men. The thing is, those are 25, 20, 30 minutes at a time. It's expensive kinds of intervention, and it's hard to scale up, and that's one of the things we're trying to think about now. Most of the interventions that we looked at, 2 years later, they don't exist. Most of the 57 studies that we looked at, these include Stepping Stones, it includes Program H that I just mentioned, Sexto Sentido in Nicaragua, and some other groups I'm sure that you all know about. Many of these, after we've done the impact evaluation, we don't have funding nor the institutional mechanisms to sustain them over the long term, nor much less to scale them up. And I think that's a huge issue that we've got to think about. We're often not in our impact evaluation also talking to women and girls. We're often just asking men. And I think part of the proof also has to be there that we triangulate. We also ask women in the same settings, hey, what do you hear? What's going on with men after they've participated in this intervention? We've got very few examples that we've been able to take these successful interventions that have shown impact and to be able to scale them up. In the context of Brazil, after we did the impact evaluation, and in India with Program H, we're now trying to embed it in the school system, getting teachers to be the facilitators of the groups. We're doing, in the context of Brazil, online training of teachers with web-based teacher continuing education, got the state secretariats of education in 2 states to support that, also trying the same thing in India. We're finding that the quality control kind of, how do I say it in an elegant way, slips out of your hands as you try to take it into a big institution like that. We haven't given up, but that's kind of our first reaction is it becomes a lot harder to coordinate and provide supervision for 2,000 teachers. But if we want to get it to some kind of a scale, we've got to figure out ways that we do that. I think too often we're still seeing our work not in a relational perspective, but too often the work with men is over here and the work with women is over there. And I think what we're trying to also figure out is how we can bring this work together and say that we're reaching both men and women in the same settings. Very limited institutional capacity to take this work to scale, and I think very limited exploration of how this work connects up with the bigger structural stuff that's happening. Tell me how I'm doing for time.
Another 5+ minutes.
5 plus? Okay. Delve into, I think I can get it in 5. I'm getting to the policy stuff here. So what's going on with men in terms of policy stuff? We've spent lots of time in the halls of the UN, getting CEDAW out there every year at CSW, measuring how countries are matching up to that. We've got the MDGs as a very gender-focused set of a global development set of goals out there. What do men think about this stuff? What we find is kind of a steeply dropping slope. That is, if you ask men about gender equality at the abstract level, they're kind of like, yeah, it's all good, kumbaya, I'm on board. And then the closer to home it gets, their support for it kind of drops toward not quite to the floor, but a step above. The blue bar, the highest one here, we ask men, if we support women's rights, it's okay for men too, men don't lose out. You see, it's quite high support, with the exception of India. India had overall the lowest support for gender equality on the part of men. So if you ask men in the abstract, most of the countries so far said, yeah, 90% and above said, yeah, it's a good thing, it sounds good, it's politically correct. Yeah, I'll check off, say that I agree with that. If we start getting down to the level of quotas, fixed places at universities, fixed government jobs, fixed places in politics, the number's still reasonably high, 60s and so, but begins to drop off. Actually, India, which possibly because there's a long history of quotas for the less privileged castes, etc., the notion of, quotas was okay, but gender equality was not, in a sense. So this gives you the beginning of the slope dropping off. Then if we asked men about if they knew about laws on gender-based violence, 90+% in all the countries included, have a law in the last 5 to 10 years, making it a punishable offense for men to use violence against a female intimate partner. Then we asked, I didn't even show the one of did men know about it because it approached 100%. We asked men if they thought it made it too easy to bring charges, and that's the blue bar here. And you'll see that actually should be 69% in the case of Croatia. But basically, 2/3 to 90% of men thought the existing law in their country made it too easy to bring charges against a man if he used violence against a female partner. Clearly, if we look at the number of men who are being arrested in the country, that's a ridiculous view. It's patently untrue. But it does give you a sense of what men think about these laws, that in a sense, and qualitatively in a couple of countries, we asked men what they thought about it. And some men said, there's no help for us. The only law out there is one that tries to punish us. So some men are kind of see these laws in very hostile ways. At the same time, they've got very confused notions about it. The second question, we also asked them about, do they think the law offered enough protection for victims or survivors of violence? And the vast majority of men thought the law also didn't support victims. So they think it's unfairly punishing men, ridiculous on the one level, and they think it doesn't offer enough protection for women, which I think is probably a true assertion or a reasonably strong assertion to hold. So it shows we're often sort of saying, pass a law, check that off our list, and we think we're done. This shows us the importance of doing public education that goes far beyond simply passing the law. I'm going to go through quickly this last one. One would leave some time. Don't pay attention to the bars, but the overall message, we asked men about their exposure to different messages about violence against women and other campaigns related to gender equality, particularly around fatherhood and around homophobia or around sexual diversity, that is, promoting rights and protection and tolerance around same-sex individuals. Many more men, and in fact, the main campaign activity that men had heard about related to gender was around violence against women. Far fewer men had heard anything about that they should get involved as fathers or around caregiving, and even fewer had heard about issues around homophobia or campaigns promoting greater respect for diversity and rights in that regard. So one of the things that men seem to be reacting to is the messages they're looking at is the traditional billboard that we see in many countries these days. Violence against women is against the law, and a man with a raised fist. Too often the images, and men telling us this, too often the images are only focusing on that negative. What are some possible other pathways that show us other things that we can do besides, clearly we have to end the violence, but that can show possible other pathways to change? We've asked a lot of questions, but I won't have time to go into it here, about men's participation in caregiving. And we did see some lights of change going on. Interesting, a couple of pieces of data that I thought were worth highlighting is that women who reported that their male partner participated more in household activities reported greater overall satisfaction and also reported greater sexual satisfaction with their male partner. That's often one that I'll hold up at a meeting with men to say, what's in it for men to look at gender change? Not that going home tonight and sweeping the floor automatically means that you'll have sex later, but to say, on aggregate, when there's cooperation between couples, that's something that men can see something positive in. As well as images of men doing caregiving work, many men can see the positive aspects there. So as I think about ways forward that this data suggests to us in thinking about policy work, I think we've got to figure out how we do better, more nuanced public education around the laws that exist on gender-based violence. We've got to think about more comprehensive prevention that understands the violent experiences that many boys experience growing up, and to understand particularly that as perhaps the key link between men's experiences of violence and their use of violence. How do we engage law enforcement and social service officials in this? I think we're not giving enough attention to engaging men in caregiving roles. Are we looking at paternity leave policies? Are we looking at how our institutions that deal with childbirth are places where men could be engaged from the beginning of children's lives, together with not giving up ever our comprehensive support for survivors, which of course we've not yet achieved in most countries. So how do we continue to do these things? We've got some evidence that in some settings, rehabilitative programs for batterers can make a difference. They're often forgotten from the equations there. But if we're talking about a third of men who have used violence, we need to understand spaces where men can overcome that violence and create those spaces. Home visitation programs, we found, have reasonable success in terms of bringing down family violence, but they seldom include men. Often they're home visitation programs for mothers. What are we also doing there to engage men? Our survey was partly inspired by a survey done in Norway called the Gender Equality and Quality of Life Survey that was done in '86 and 2006. And at the risk of idealizing Planet Norway with its very comprehensive social welfare and gender equality policies, they are #1 in the world's gender equality index. And so we found it useful to kind of listen to the researchers, and many of the questions that we used in images came from their survey. As they looked at 20 years of Norway's history, when they implemented a comprehensive set of gender equality policies, trying to achieve pay parity for women, extensive paternity leave policies that many of you know about, including a non-transferable portion for men that is paid at a portion of the man's salary, trying to make the workplace more gender equitable. What they found 20 years later was a reduction in violence against children, a reduction of violence against women, and that women and men converged towards some equality in tasks at home, and that both men and women found gender equality to be something good for their lives. And I think the parties in power in Norway have also figured out that gender equality brings votes, something that some leaders in parts of the world might also figure out. How is it that we can provide gender equality as something that's a public good for all, that in fact politicians who put it in place can get reelected, which is what most politicians like to do. So let me end there. And just one, I think part of our challenge in the field of gender-based violence is trying to find what men can find in terms of their self-interest in changing. And I like this quote from a colleague, Carol Gilligan, who some of you may have read, that I think is useful to kind of thinking about where we start, that patriarchy is an order of domination, privileging some men over others and subordinating women. But in dividing men from men and men from women, it creates a rift in the psyche, dividing everyone from parts of themselves. And I think if part of our work can figure out at the policy level and the program level how men can find ways that they also benefit and become more whole as human beings by embracing gender equality, we may have a better chance of advancing than some of our negative images and some of our kind of punitive approaches that I think we too often get stuck in. Let me stop there. Thanks.